Okay, everybody, let's get started with inspiration and education and humor and participation. Urantia Book. What is it all about? Can it be trusted? What are its main tenets? And is this some kind of a new story, some kind of a new myth, a new description of reality? Or is it metaphor, or a better metaphor, an updated symbol of who we are, what we are, where we are? So let's start with a little bit of some just more factual overview of the Urantia Book, since our objective here is Urantia Book education. But when we say, or when I say Urantia Book, I mean in the broad sense, not just some words on paper, but also the spirit of this text. And the spirit of it goes beyond it, and that's why we define this, or we call this conference Urantia Book and Beyond, because we're not stuck in the text. We're not doctrinaire about this thing, and also the text is full of ambiguous passages. So it is subject to interpretation. So it's what's on the page and what's beyond it, that being your imagination, your interpretation, and that being this community which is growing, which has a discourse among itself, if you know what I mean, as to what this is all about. And then beyond that are other revelations that some claim to have about this teaching. And we'll get to that actually tomorrow mainly. So some key facts. A lot of you know these things, many of you don't, so let's go over it real quick. This book was received in a quasi-mysterious way for over a period of 21 years in Chicago, to a group that had two parts of it. There was a group called the Contact Commission of 6 people, and then there was a larger group called the Forum, and the Forum was convened by the Contact Commission. That was up to 400 people. These papers would appear in some fashion. Then the Forum would read the papers and feed questions from the 6 people in the Contact Commission who had a kind of contact with these celestials. And you can think of it the way Edgar Cayce had his contact. The contact person, we call him the contact personality, was fully asleep, and through him statements would be made. However, there were other forms of contact we'll get to in a minute through him. So there's all these printings. I don't even know how many printings anymore. There's 196 chapters or papers, a lot of pages, and 4 big parts. A lot of people don't know that the Urantia Book was copyrighted by the original publishers, and at some point it came out in court that there was no author. They could not produce evidence of an author. And they spent a lot of money, in the 7 figures, defending it, because they felt they were defending a revelation to the planet. And the other side spent a lot of money too. And it went to the Court of 7th Circuit or something, Court of Appeals, and they struck down the copyright saying you haven't produced an author. So there's no author. That's why there's no names on it. The translations are a very important part of this. The translations are multiple, almost all the major languages. Chinese is coming up, Arabic is coming up, and all the European languages. So just a quick overview of some of the main tenets before we get into a little bit more substance on the question of this universe. We've already seen that there are galaxies that are inhabited and galaxies that are not inhabited. So the inhabited galaxies are in the inner band that we saw in that illustration. And the outer galaxies are not yet inhabited. But there's a total of roughly 7 trillion inhabited worlds with humanoid beings, 7 trillion. The spirituality of the Urantia Book is what we might call an evolutionary spirituality, and you evolve a soul. The soul is an evolutionary aspect of who you are, and it evolves by your decisions, by your convictions, by your experiences, and it's actually a storehouse for your experiences. The soul stores who you really are in your best and highest decisions leading to your experiences, which are literally like recorded as the soul. We'll get into that a lot more later. Another huge part of the Urantia book is a revelation about the indwelling spirit. So the notion of the indwelling spirit, which you may know from Quakerism, for example, there's a divine spark within. Actually, in the original Greek, some of the original Greek Gnostic texts, they talk about the spirit within, the pneuma in Greek. And the Urantia book has a major revelation about the nature of this indwelling spirit. And it has an odd word for it. It's called the thought adjuster. We'll get into that more. The philosophy of the Urantia book is maybe my favorite part because it's so brilliantly and articulately presented. It's a holistic, integral philosophy of joining truth, beauty, and goodness in your experience, but also as a way of painting a canvas of all reality. All of reality and all of evolution is an evolution of the values of truth, beauty, and goodness, which actually are the components of love. The theology of the Urantia book is theistic. It also is non-dual at the same time. So in the kind of dispute here in Marin County between non-dualism and theists, the Urantia book is a both and. In the Urantia book, God is an absolute, but also God is evolutionary. There's two sides to the deity. One is existential, and the other is experiential evolutionary. The afterlife, according to the Urantia book, is a major part of everything because the universe is set up so that we ascend. It's what we call an ascension cosmology. We're ascending through spheres, through higher and higher levels. More on that later. In history, the Urantia book is also a lot of revelations here. It's a major revelation about human history, particularly prehistory, the prehistory of from way back up to Sumerian times, so what we call pre-Sumerian history, which we'll get into more. Also, very important, really central, is that the Urantia book is complicated and difficult for many reasons, but one reason is it tells the story heretofore not really understood about an angelic rebellion that marred and scarred our planet in far distant times. In politics, the Urantia book is an advocate of world unity, world federation. Way before its time, it was talking about a United Nations kind of federation, and it says that humanity is sovereign. Humanity as humanity is sovereign over the planet. In regard to Jesus, many of you know that the fourth part of the Urantia book is the purported life and teachings of Jesus according to the angelic record. So that's pretty controversial, and a lot of Christians have had trouble with that. And I'll tell you, as a student of the Bible, I love the Bible accounts. I think they're amazing and beautiful, and have a literary quality that's very attractive. The Urantia book's version of the Gospels, you might say, is 700 pages, so you're getting a lot more information, and we'll talk about it some more. I think you came in late. We're only taking questions at the microphone. Yeah, don't worry about it, though. I'll answer that. The way the Urantia book came through is everyone's going to ask, so I'll answer that. The Urantia book is a product of a fairly mysterious process. There are books written about how it came through. It is not routine channeling at all. It is believed by some that these chapters materialized. It was direct materialization. And others dispute that. So we don't have the facts. And there's a book coming out soon that has yet another version because the people that received it were given a mandate to just, it's not important how it came through. We want people to look at the literary quality of the text and not really orient to how it came through. However, we all want to know how it came through. So I don't agree with that. I think we do want to know. And so generally, let's say it's a mysterious process, and there were many parts of it. There were direct contact with celestial beings that was auditory. There was materializations, very likely, and some combinations of these where people did automatic writing. But the text itself is not a product of automatic writing. And if you examine the literary quality of this, and I'm an editor and a book publisher, it's impossible for somebody to channel something with perfect grammar and perfect use of vocabulary that's consistent for 2,000 pages. It just can't happen. It can't come through the human mind that way. So that's why most of us consider it to be sort of a miraculous appearance. I just want to read you and just give you a sense of the quality of some of the language. And some of this language is complicated, and so this is what you're in for if you read it, if you haven't read it yet. So this is the opening words. In the minds of the mortals of Urantia, that being the name of your world, there exists great confusion respecting the meaning of such terms as God, divinity, and deity. Human beings are still more confused and uncertain about the relationships of the divine personalities that are designated by these numerous appellations. Because of this conceptual poverty associated with so much ideational confusion, I have been directed to formulate this introductory statement by the Orvonton Corps of Truth Revealers. So who are these truth revealers? They purportedly hail from the center of our, what we call the superuniverse, which was represented in the film as one galaxy, but that's an artist's representation. It's actually not one galaxy. It is a cluster of galaxies, and I think Phil said it was 100,000, wherever you are, Phil, 100,000 galaxies in the local cluster. Remember the name of the cluster? I forget. Sagittarius? And it was a cluster of galaxies. So these beings come from the center of this unit to their revelators, and we call them the revelators. Now, kind of jumping in with both feet into substantive teachings. According to the Urantia book and my interpretation, our chief difficulty is that in prehistoric times we had a calamity, and I call it our transhuman history, actually. It's kind of superhuman history, and destiny have been lost. And the source of this difficulty is an angelic rebellion that we mentioned, and there was what we call a double default. And that will be defined, so kind of keep that in mind. There was a double default in our prehistory. A little bit on the core spiritual teachings. I'm weaving topics in various directions to try to give you a holistic picture. So these are key spiritual teachings. God indwells each of us and loves us beyond all measure. I will read all the words up there, so you don't have to be reading and listening. So just know that I'm reading the words. God is our divine Father and Mother. Important contribution of the Urantia book is the motherhood of God as well as the fatherhood of God. Love God and others as yourself, the golden rule. Soul evolution and ascension. We have an eternal life of love and service ahead of us. And finally, the universe is evolutionary. The finite aspect of God evolves with and as us. Again, these are my interpretations. According to the Urantia book, there's a supreme adventure that not only we are on, but all beings on all planets. And so when they say planets, they mean billions, actually trillions of planets, of humanoid beings that look like us, but not all of them look like us. The sublime search for the God of universes is the supreme adventure of the inhabitants of all inhabited worlds. Their definition of faith I find liberating. And they actually say faith liberates. Their definition of belief is interesting. Belief is always limiting and binding. Faith is expanding and releasing. Here's my, I think, favorite passage. Belief fixates, faith liberates. Belief fixates, faith liberates. It is a living experience concerned with spiritual meanings, divine ideals, and supreme values. I have never seen a definition of faith like the one you get in the Urantia book, and there's whole chapters, whole sections on faith. So this is just one little statement among many. So the parts of the Urantia book. 4 big parts. First part, part 1, is central and superuniverses. So this is the cosmology section. Part 2 is on the local universe. So in the Urantia book, you have these big galaxies that are inhabited, and then you have local sections of the galaxies that are administrative units. So part 2 is about that, and that is all revelatory. There's really nothing like it. Part 3 is the history of our planet, Urantia. Part 4, Life and Teachings of Jesus. So, Urantia is the celestial name of our planet. It seems like people should know that. There are things in the Urantia book that are what I call spiritually incorrect, especially in Marin County. So, the Urantia book uses language which today we may consider to be patriarchal language. So, bear in mind as you go through it that it comes through in a different era, in a different generation, before we had feminism, before we had the current movement toward liberating women from centuries of oppression in religion. So its language actually straddles both generations. There's what you might call feminist theology in the Urantia book, but there's also more conservative language. So they intentionally, I think, bridge that because the group they were working with in the 20s and 30s, I mentioned 20s and 30s is when this was coming through, was so totally overwhelmed by the text that they couldn't do, 1990s style, mentality for them. It was already completely too much for them. So don't expect too much of it, but you're still getting an awful lot of revelatory material. So God is a father, but also God is a mother. But they use father language a lot. Also, politically incorrect is the notion that the divine is personal. And these days, at least around here, the divine is not seen as personal, unless you might happen to be a bhakti practitioner in Hinduism. But generally, we, these days, seemingly think of God as a great force or divine energy, but we don't think of God as personally interested in us. So we have removed, we being the postmodern generation, we've removed this Christian notion of a loving God who watches over us and corrects us. We rebelled against that, and we didn't want to think of God as personal, but the Urantia book reinstates that at a much higher level. Also, it seems to be politically incorrect, unless you're living in the Midwest, to think of Jesus as incarnate God. But the Urantia book reinstates that at a much higher level of understanding. Also, in many circles, including I'm in a men's group where every one of the men in the men's group believes that they have reincarnated many times. But the Urantia book actually does not affirm reincarnation in the kind of Hindu sense. It has a technical meaning for that, but it does not affirm the idea that all of us had past lives and that we're going through these different lives until we get off the wheel and then we can go somewhere else. It's a whole different cosmology. But there are, what I believe in my interpretation, are reincarnation aspects, but I call them technical. Finally, philosophic spirituality. You're supposed to have your spirituality, and it's not supposed to be mental. It's supposed to be not very cognitive, right? It's supposed to be sort of going with the flow. But the Urantia book certainly has that aspect, but it's also very philosophic. So we used to say people are either philosophic or they're sub-philosophic. And this is how when we were introducing Urantia book to people years ago, if somebody was sub-philosophic, we probably wouldn't even introduce them to it because they wouldn't like it, because it's cognitive. It's giving you philosophic underpinning for its theology, for its spirituality, for everything. And so it is truly philosophic, and there are a lot of philosophers who have spent their life looking at the philosophy of the Urantia book, and we're going to have one in about a short time from now. It's going to be speaking to us. Now, politically incorrect. The Urantia book is amazing in that it has a revelation about race evolution, and we're not going to cover too much of that except today at 4 p.m., and the evolution of races from an early, very, very early time that is all new in the Urantia book. They do differ genetically, and they blend over time so that the differences are unimportant. However, in our case, we had, remember the double default? We had a double default, so we did not get to have the opportunity for race blending, which normal planets do. We'll get to that later. Second, politically incorrect, that Satan is a real being. So for most of us, we would think that's a fundamentalist position, and we don't believe in things like that. But the Urantia book says there was such a person and also such a person as Lucifer, and we're going to hear a lot about them later on. And they were the perpetrators of the angelic rebellion, and we'll get to that more. Atlantis, according to the Urantia book, they don't use the term Atlantis, but there's something that I call Atlantis, because I published a book about it, is the Garden of Eden is the same thing as Atlantis. And believe it or not, it's located in Cyprus, but it mainly sunk beneath the ocean. And I mentioned Democratic World Federation is a teaching of the Urantia book right now that's not in favor. A little bit more on that. This is a book that I co-authored about that part of the Urantia book. It's on the notion of citizenship, but it's global citizenship that's all over the place in the Urantia book. Also, they talk about universe citizenship. The Urantia book is, some think it's socialistic in its teaching. It certainly is not praising the profit motive, but it says you can't remove the profit motive until people are ready. It puts this family at the center, not just here, but on all planets, and universally, the family is at the center of social and political life. There's a new teaching on social sustainability that is, we're going to talk about more tomorrow. Also, depicts Jesus as favoring a unified world and world federation. It's very radical. This is something we're going to, again, talk about tomorrow, just showing it to you just as a little hint. Just quickly, there are some major artists who secretly read the Urantia book, and here's two examples. Here's another one. He lives locally, and I'm trying to reach him. Also, we found out through an acquaintance of mine who's a special ops soldier who was decorated in the Oval Office, and he saw a Urantia book open on Bill Clinton's desk. It was had coffee stains, it was dog-eared, and that's the story. I won't read it to you. This same guy went back to the Oval Office and talked to Clinton twice, second time also. Some of you may know this wonderful singer and songwriter. He's changed his career, is now a Urantia minister. I'm going to run you through a few of these, what I call amazing factoids. For example, about Jesus. You know, the Bible, Jesus ascends to heaven, and he is at the right hand of the Father. And the Trinity is male, and then there's the Holy Spirit. We're not sure what that is. But in the Urantia book, there's this intervening level, which is the local universe deities are male-female. So that's the first amazing factoid. So there's a deity spouse of Jesus called Mother Spirit. The two of them created a local universe. They're creator beings. So in Christian theology, it's often seen that Christ is a creator, and the Urantia book says that as well. But he has a co-equal creator, and they created the local universe working with other beings, but they're the source of life and of the patterns of life, the two of them together. We don't have 10 million inhabited planets. Jerry, you always know that number. What is it? How many?
About 3,800,000.
3,800,000 local planets so far, in counting, but there's inhabitable potential of 10 million local planets. The Urantia book tells a lot of detail about Jesus' early life and his missing years. It says he was also a leather worker and a caravan driver. He had siblings. His father died, and he had to raise the kids as the oldest son. So he had fatherhood experience. He had 8 siblings. And in the Bible, there's, I think, a handful of resurrection appearances, but in the Urantia book, he has 40 resurrection appearances. Here's some more factoids. The universe has a center. That's something very much rejected in today's theology and cosmology. Space is nearly absolute in the Urantia book. Time is not. The central universe, which we saw earlier, it's eternal. It's uncreated. It was not created. It's always been there. There's a whole Big Bang thing we're going to get to this afternoon. We talked about 7 trillion inhabited planets, and we talked about that the universe is like Star Trek, but no warfare. So I wanted to take a break and just relax a little bit and turn the cameras off, and I want to just ask you, turn the lights on, just say hello to your neighbor. There's been a lot of words, why don't you turn to the person next to you, introduce yourself, and we'll just take a quick break. Okay, everybody, let's start up again. The Urantia book is really big, and we have to spend all this time. So the next item is a point of controversy, or has been. Now it's not really at all controversial among Urantia book students and scholars. The Urantia book tells you that it's material, that it's the raw material that it worked with. Much of it is revelatory, purportedly, but much of it is from human sources. Why human sources? Why would a revelatory book say that it's not all revelatory? A lot of reasons for that. We'll have some Q&A coming up here. You can ask more about this. But what I will do first is I will read to you what it says. It says, in all of our efforts to reveal truth, we give preference to the highest existing human concepts. We may resort to pure revelation only when the concept of presentation has no adequate previous expression by the human mind. So, again, I read that. When the concept of presentation has no adequate previous expression, then they can resort to pure revelation. We have selected as the basis of these papers more than 1,000 human concepts, and then it goes on and tells you where they come from, wherein these human concepts assembled from the God-knowing mortals of the past and present are inadequate to portray the truth as we are directed to reveal it. We will unhesitatingly supplement them. For this purpose, drawing upon our own superior knowledge. So, the Urantia book is also not politically correct in the sense that they are superior to us, and they tell you. And but these are beings that are, billions of years old. They're higher celestial beings, very high beings. They're the revelators, as I said. So this is their method. Their methodology is a mix of human and divine. Why is that? So you can bridge human to divine. So if it was all far out revelation, we just couldn't assimilate it. And they have what they call laws of revelation, where you can't be too far ahead of your time because it will be too jarring to the cultures when you reveal something to them. And in fact, this is the truth, because the Urantia book has not been well received in many circles because it's too much, too advanced and too different. So, but what you can do is it's what I do. I point out to people that, well, there are human sources here. You can see Aristotle, you can see Hegel, you can see great thinkers of the past. You can see passages that they've taken and woven into the discussion. So this is the human sources idea, and the book here shown is the first big book where an author traced the human sources to the original texts written by these authors. The human source authors are actual persons, or authors of texts, theological texts, historical, even scientific texts. And we have now identified several hundred of these. So next section, we're going to talk about the stages of revelation. I'll move through this kind of quickly because we're going to cover it some more later. So again, why do we need a revelation? Please, what do we have to have a revelation for? We already have established religions. We already have Catholic Church. We already have, 1 billion Muslims. We have Buddhists. We have, why do we need a revelation? And according to the Urantia book, we evolve our religions and our science, but there are points at which we have earned a revelation. It's sort of like your child is growing up, and there's a certain point where you intervene with your child and you say, it's like this. The world is like this. And you don't do that all day long with your kid. You let them have experience, and then you intervene and you teach them. And it is, yes, a little spooky. Everybody, turn your phones off, please. I'm glad it didn't happen when we're talking about Satan, Right. So, secondly, there's what we call epochal revelation, And then there's personal auto, they call auto revelation. Each person gets an incoming stream of truth. So the Urantia book says there were 5 great revelations, and especially you have a revelation when you really need it, when you've hit bottom, so to speak. So the first of these 5 is hard to assimilate this. This is weird sounding stuff. So 500,000 years ago, there was an incarnation of avatars, you might say, of 100 beings who came with an unseen being to the planet when we were in a fairly primitive state. 200,000 years ago, there was a rebellion of the unseen being who went to the dark side. And he was the leader of all the celestial beings on the planet, so most of them went to the dark side. And the Urantia book, everything is cross planets, right? So there's 37 total planets joined an angelic rebellion. This is the location, purportedly, where this delegation came down in the Persian Gulf. That's Iran, that's Somalia down here, and it's a place called Dalmatia, completely unknown to history. The second great event, is skipping quickly now, is this location, Cyprus. And the land you see that's sunken is where this Garden of Eden, according to the Urantia book, was located. And the teaching of the Urantia book is that this mission defaulted. We're going to learn more about it. The third great revelation is somewhat in the Bible, and some of you may remember from Genesis the historical person named, or mythical actually, historical person named Melchizedek, who in the Bible is the person who Abraham tithed to. So the first tithing, 10% tithing, was this event in Genesis 14 when Abraham met this guy that just kind of walks in from nowhere, says, "I'm Melchizedek, king of Salem." Salem becomes Jerusalem. He blessed Abraham, and Abraham thenceforth gave a tenth of his booty, actually, from warfare. Fourth great revelation is the incarnation of Christ. The Urantia book says he was a historic personality who was a divine incarnation, unlike many New Age folks think of him as just a really great guy, not an incarnate deity. Most of the Christian beliefs about him are correct, but the Urantia book adds many more. The Urantia book contains a lengthy biography, as we know. In his deity aspect, Jesus is known as Christ Michael. That's their new name for him. So as the incarnate man from Nazareth, he's known as Jesus. But as deity, which is what he was pre-existing, he's known as Christ Michael. And as I mentioned, he has a deity consort. So her name is Mother Spirit. She's co-creator, and she is stationary. She doesn't move around like Jesus does. Why doesn't she move around? Because she is everything. She is all space. Space is her body. She does not have to incarnate because she's already incarnate as space, as the worlds. She's the source of the Holy Spirit. Christ Michael's the source of the Spirit of Truth. They're two distinct spirits. This is something I added. This is my own interpretation. It's not in the Urantia book. There's a feminine spirit called Urantia. So the fifth epochal revelation, a little bit of quick history on this. I mentioned started in Chicago, and I mentioned the form. You can see the first shot of the original group that was reading the Urantia papers and then feeding questions to the celestials. The celestials would then revise the chapter based on the questions. So there's a Q&A going on. And by the way, parenthetically, the copyright of the Urantia book, one of the ways they claimed copyright is they said, well, we're a bunch of humans. We interacted with these angels. We asked questions, and they revised it. So we get the copyright because we had human influence on the text. And one of the courts, district court, 5th District Court, said that's a pretty good argument for copyright. But it was struck down at a higher court. So this is the kind of the hero of the Urantia Revelation. This is Bill Sadler, who was a well-known psychiatrist and author of the period. He studied with Freud briefly. He was a high-credentialed scholar, but very independent, and there's a lot to say about him. We don't have a lot of time. This is him in 1955. He died in 1968. He was right in the center of this as really the leader of it, and he was in the original group I mentioned of 6 called the Contact Group, Contact Commission. Some people think that this fellow was the contact personality. I don't personally believe it, but there's a whole book on this, and it's plausible. We know that this person was speaking audibly in Edgar Cayce style. There is lore saying there was written materials that appeared. There's lore saying there's audio direct voices being heard, and there's also some who believe there was a direct materialization, and in particular, part 4, the teachings of Jesus appeared all at once. Just going to move quickly through some slides. This is something we're going to cover tomorrow on new enhancements, purportedly. These are the books I've published, available. This is something we're going to talk about tomorrow. A little bit on cosmology, quickly. We're going to cover cosmology today at 1:30, so if you can make it, that's going to be a great panel, a great first openings teaching by Phil Calabrese, an expert in that field. We've already looked at some of these images. By the way, it rotates counterclockwise. So this outer band you can see on the far, my right, are uninhabited galaxies, and this goes out almost to infinity, but it's not infinite. Here's a top-down picture of what's known as the grand universe. These are the inhabited, the first band out are inhabited galaxies, but it's an artist's representation. It's actually, these are galaxy clusters around a central island, which is not visible to the eye. So here's another picture of those outer bands of uninhabited galaxies. These rotate in alternating. The inner band is counterclockwise, the next band is clockwise, and the next band is counterclockwise, next one is opposite. So there's a balance of all these forces, and these are the largest forces in the universe. This is another depiction of the central universe, known as Havona. Here's an artist representation showing the 7 great inhabited galaxy clusters and the center. This is my own development of theology that I have worked on myself. I studied a little bit with Ted Peters, who's speaking later, at Berkeley, and wrote a paper on cosmotheocentrism, a term I made up. The Urantia Book Theology says God is also at the center of all things, but it's omnicentric as well. Omnicentric, the center is everywhere, but there's also a geographic center. The Urantia Book is panentheistic, which means God within and God as theistic, beloved, external God. So we have both the interior gift of deity and the exterior God of the universes, creator. Urantia Book is definitely Trinitarian in a big way. It's incarnational and it's evolutionary in its theology. God is transcendent, really the bearded guy in the sky in the metaphorical sense that this is a person who has infinite capacity to know and love us. And God is immanent, so this is the panentheistic, right? So the immanent deity and the external deity, who is our creator, father, mother. The Trinitarian notion is, I think one of the great revelations of the Urantia book is its Trinitarian theology, and I think everybody interested in theology should read those papers that are in the first 10 chapters. It's tough reading. Come to my study group in Marin, and we can read together. The Trinity is deemed to be an essential and inevitable, that the Father had to differentiate from himself as the Son, who had to differentiate as the third person. And the Urantia book theology adds the fact that when the Trinity came into being, then the central universe was inevitable. But it didn't happen in time. It happened in eternity, meaning it didn't have a sequence. The Universal Father achieves the free will liberation from the bonds of infinity and the fetters of eternity by the technique of trinitization, threefold deity personalization. You figure it out. We'll have to skip this one, but this is an example. You can just kind of scan it. This is an example of the language in the early papers, which is advanced theological, cosmological language. This is incarnational deity. There's many artist representations now by Urantian artists. I want to say, going back to this language, that by contrast with Gnostic channeled texts, the Urantia book language is not obscure. It's clear and grammatically near perfect. It's complex, though. So I would distinguish it, if you're new to this, from far out channeled stuff. This is like philosophic and exacting and precise language, not obscure language. So very important. God has an evolutionary aspect known as God the Supreme. Yeah, that's kind of funny, isn't it? So God the Supreme is a facet of deity. This is the evolutionary facet. This is how you get a theodicy. Know the word theodicy? This is the theology that explains how evil can be present and many other things. And the theodicy of the Urantia book explains such things because it's evolutionary. Not only is the universe evolutionary, but God is evolutionary. So God cannot, by fiat, make things right. We have to evolve that way. God unfolds, I'm reading it now, God unfolds via the evolving souls of all humans on all planets. Through virtuous action, we contribute to this evolution of the finite aspect of God. So this finite aspect of God is not complete. So we complete God. How do you like that? So this is like the process theology that's now being taught. So here's a key point in the theology, is that deity is dual in presence. There's the existential, eternal, and then there's the experiential, evolutionary deity. So it's a very cardinal point in the Urantia book, is you have both. A little bit more on organization. There's 7 great galaxy clusters. I'm going to skip this. Any of you have an interest in planetary types, talk to me. Typical planetary timeline. You have these stages. But this is us. So in our case, remember I mentioned the double default. 2 of the great events in our timeline were default events. They failed. And these are external off-planet visitations which failed because of the angelic rebellion in far distant times. We're covering that more later today. We're going to learn about this character who is the fallen planetary prince, they call it in the Urantia book. He's the one that led the rebellion. I found this picture. It seems to look like it. So the Urantia book reveals to us who this person is. The Bible calls this the devil. But his inspiration and his boss, so to speak, was someone named Lucifer. Lucifer had a manifesto, which was, God does not exist. How's that for brazen? He's an angel, and he's saying God does not exist. God is a myth invented by higher beings, because Lucifer was like a middle-level bureaucrat in the angelic hierarchy. So it's a typical jealousy of the middle bureaucrats of their bosses. So he's saying, my boss doesn't exist. Now, this is Adam and Eve. We're kind of upset about the situation. So Adam and Eve incarnate with a mission, not easy to explain, but they are biological uplifters. And this tells you a little bit about it. They were what on TV we call ancient astronauts. Who watches the ancient astronauts program? Good. They're 37,000 years ago. They have something I call biological grace. By intermarrying with their children, we get genetic enhancement. But that did not work out for us. That's why we have genetic issues and we have racial disparity. Well, just to end a bit on spirituality in the Urantia book. They're very important, and you're going to hear from Jerry Lane on this tomorrow in particular. They're irreducible aspects of who we are: body, mind, soul, spirit, personality. In the Urantia book, the depiction of what the soul is pretty new. Also, its depiction of personality, I think, is completely new. Personality is an important aspect. I'm going to talk about it for a minute. Personality is directly bestowed by fiat from God the Father. Personality, your personality, is not a thing or a being. It is super existential. It is spirit. We think of spirit as being sovereign, but actually personality is sovereign because personality is bestowed with will. So your free will, your freedom, your free will, some people call it free won't. Your free will is an endowment that comes with your personhood. It's sacred. Personality provides the ability to be self-aware. So the self-awareness we have is provided by this gift. Finally, the personality is unchanging. Everything else about us changes. So in Buddhism, we say all is impermanent, right? Any Buddhists? All is impermanent. So this contravenes that, saying, yes, all is impermanent except the person. Personhood is sacred. It is unchanging. It is not in flux. That's why you have an ascension after death, whereas in Buddhism, you don't essentially go anywhere because there's no person there. Key teaching is the gospel of Jesus, went from the Bible, pretty much the same, without the atonement doctrine. So the blood atonement doctrine, that's negated by the Urantia book. We've already heard about the indwelling of the divine. Here's an important point, and I'm going to close shortly here. In Hinduism, the notion of Atman, you may know, is quite similar to the notion of the indwelling God in the Urantia book. In the Buddha nature in Buddhism is stated to be nearly identical to the Urantia teaching of the indwelling spirit. So it's one reason I became a Buddhist practitioner as a young man, because the Urantia book said it's the same teaching, but of course Buddhism doesn't have a theistic theology, so it's missing something. We're going to talk about this in a few minutes with Professor Jeff Waddles. And we're going to talk at 11 o'clock about the soul, how it grows, that the soul survives death, and that we have an afterlife destiny. And our afterlife destiny is sounds a little weird, but we're going to ascend through 570 levels. And this is the final step in the afterlife. You become, I found this picture of what's his name, Gandalf. And this is where you're going in your ascension. So in Hinduism, we say we get off the wheel, we go up to somewhere, right? So the Urantia book tells you in great detail where you're going when you ascend. And you ascend to perfection. You ascend to that central universe. When you get to the central universe, you go through these worlds that I showed you, the billion worlds, And then you go to the very center of all things. Once you're there, you're done. You are perfected. So we are perfecting, and the beings there are perfect already. So the perfecting meets the perfect, and that's the symphony of the Urantia book, is the evolutionary meets the perfect in this central aisle, and then you are called a finaliter, which I think is a very nice word. You're final, you're finalitized. Instead of 6 sentences, you have 56. You're billions of years old, and if you left some money in a bank account, you're going to have a lot of interest on that money. So that's it on the introduction to the Urantia book. We got time for a couple of questions. And if you have them, come up here. If you don't, we're running late, and that's okay. Let's say I'll take 2 questions. So you could face toward the audience.
Oh.
Yeah.
Hello.
And me. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. I was interested that you had the diagram, the Enneagram, as the types. Can you tell me how that relates to Urantia?
Someone here may know more about this, but I think it says there are 12 types, actually. But I use the Enneatype system. No, in the Urantia typology. So they don't say much about it. But it may be related to the Enneatype system. But I use that anyway in the slide because I like it. Because it's not very exact in the Urantia book about the types. Anybody else?
You mentioned about the areas where the Urantia book is sort of incongruent, or there's iffy places, or I'm trying to remember the exact word that you mentioned, but so can you speak more about that in terms of, in other words, they still need to fill us in, or there's places that seem contradictory, or what is that about?
Thank you, Christy. Christy is going to be speaking tomorrow morning, by the way. It has, I think I was speaking of the human sources, maybe? And so let me just add to what I said on that. The Urantia book is, you know, we're now grown up enough that we don't have to believe that our sacred texts are perfect. So the Urantia book is really the first sacred text that self-deconstructs, really, because it doesn't say this is perfect, this is the final word. It never says that. It says that there's a mix of human and divine in all cases. In fact, that's the whole point of all of this, is a co-creative project of the human and divine. So your scripture is also a co-creative project of human sources and divine revelation. But there are a lot of places in the Urantia book that a lot of us don't agree with, for example. I would not say that it's inconsistent. I've spent 40 years on this thing. I can't find inconsistencies in the teaching. There are places that you can tell are the human sources because they don't quite sound revelatory. And for example, on gender, and on shamanism, what it says about shamanism, I consider to be wrong. Why? Because it just took the shamanistic knowledge at the time, which was primitive, and it plugged that in, and they didn't want to say much about it. It's got sociology that I think is out of date. The science is seen by some as being out of date on purpose, but Phil's going to speak about that today at 1:30. So there are things in it that, on race, for example, which are quite controversial. So that's why there is a need for a community of interpretation. And in fact, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because there's so much here that we need a community to start working on this stuff. And those books over there, yeah. Just a few books over here, and we need to have hundreds of books and lots of scholarship. When I was studying at Berkeley, I couldn't do a dissertation because there was no sources to work on. It's just one book. We need to have scholarly work. And so that's my answer to that. Did you have one more? One more, and then we'll stop. Yeah, sure.
Since you briefly mentioned Buddhism at the end as being non-theistic, I'm wondering, the perception of the world religions, of the other spiritual traditions from the perspective of the Urantia book. I remember reading very short paragraphs in it, kind of like a summation of other wisdom traditions that in my view were very incomplete, if I might just say so. And there's also a reason why Buddhism is non-theistic. The Buddha was reluctant to create concepts because he would know if he would talk about God, we humans project a certain notion and concept on the divine, which will never be adequate in the end because of the limitations of our human perception. So I don't know if we will touch upon that later today or maybe tomorrow.
Through the weekend, yeah. Its teaching on Buddhism, for example, is not that inspiring because it uses the human sources on Buddhism that were existent in the 1930s, and they're all wrong and out of date. And so once you get to be a scholar with the Urantia book, then you identify those passages. And what you need to do is fill in the current knowledge and just forget about that. It's what we might call heuristic. So it just provides you a reference text. It's a reference text. And look at the Bible. Look at all the crazy things in the Bible. But we use it as a reference text. I mean, the Quran, these. So at least you have a reference, and then you build your theology and your systems and in correcting it according to current knowledge. So on evolutionary items like that, in part 3 especially, all that it needs updating. So that's just the reference material. But you can tell in the section on Buddhism, there are parts of that where they intervene and they say, but we want to tell you that on the question of the indwelling spirit, they're perfectly right. So that's the revelator saying, there's where you got it right, and they're superseding the human source. They also state that Buddha stood for a universe of justice, an absolute justice, and they exalted that, and they said he was totally right on that as well. But the rest of it is questionable. Okay.